I don't know what happened.
It's all right, Antonella. I've already introduced the event this week, and I already introduced you. So I think we are ready to go at this point. So again, it's really my pleasure to introduce Antonella Tramacere, and hopefully PowerPoint is going to work this time. Let's try, Antonella. Okay?
Yes. So I'm going to share the screen and to share my presentation now. I'm not sure what you are going to see, but anyway, we hope so. I hope that it's going to be good. What are you seeing?
Nothing right now. It's frozen.
It is frozen still?
Yeah. We don't see anything. Can I try to move from screen to screen? Okay.
Are you seeing something?
Well, we see the title page.
Okay.
Lost in abstraction, but we don't see.
And now?
Colin can see the slide, and we can see the slide. But can you move from slide to slide?
Okay. Can I move?
Yeah.
Do you see moving the slides?
No.
Nothing.
Yeah.
You see nothing now.
Yeah, we just see the first slide, but it's just not moving from that slide to the next slide.
Okay, then I will do like this. I don't know what's the problem with this. It worked so far.
Yeah, so Colin is helpfully suggesting to take it out of presentation mode, if you know how to do that. Let me, Colin seems to be to have ideas, and since he's your co-author, let me promote him to a panelist status, and maybe he can give us a hand.
So are you not seeing anything now?
We're still seeing the title page.
Okay, I will like this.
Oh, it's working.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, I will go faster than I was supposed to be. Thanks, and sorry for the problem.
Thanks, Antonella, and my apologies for this complication.
I tried many times, and it was working. So the virtual world is like this. So
all right. So thanks for your patience. It's really my pleasure to introduce Antonella. I won't repeat the introduction second time. Antonella, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I would like to thank you, Edward, first for giving me the possibility to present the progress of my research here, because I started the research right before coming to Pittsburgh, and also because this research is in collaboration with Colin Allen. This is, as consequence, it is doubly bound to the center and to HPS in general. So I will give you a brief introduction for just setting the stage of what I'm going to talk about. As you know, many thinkers have reflected on self-awareness and asked whether self-awareness, the recognition of the own thought, of the own body, of the one's own actions, is an intrinsic property of the mind, whether it is part of intentionality and how it is connected to intentionality, whether self-awareness is part of nature and how we can inquire, we can investigate it, and whether self-awareness is a phenomenon that is present in any living organism, at least in animal species, or it is a phenomenon present only in human beings. And in the last decades, we have assisted to many attempts to operationalize self-awareness through appropriate behavioral markers, and so to identify possible signs of the self-recognition in other animal species. And also many attempts also were devoted to inquire possible neural correlates of self-awareness and self-recognition. So what I'm going to talk about today is a specific aspect of self-awareness, which is action awareness, the subjective experience of being the author of an action, also called subjective agency. And my goal here will be to inquire into subjective agency in a way that we can develop non-verbal measures, so to make the investigation of action awareness not contaminated by theory and language, and in a way that it can pave the way to investigations in developmental and comparative psychology. And I will then proceed as follows. I will firstly sketch a classical notion of subjective agency. Then I will state some criticisms that have been developed to it. And I will sketch another proposal, and then conclude by analyzing possible implications and perspectives, both at the theoretical and experimental level. So let's start with the classical notion, with the classical account of subjective agency. This account finds its root in the work of earlier phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, for example. And then it has been developed extensively by contemporary phenomenologists like Gallagher, Legrand, Pacherizza, Avi, and many others, who have connected and extended the classical account by connecting it to the results and findings obtained in cognitive science and psychology. And this classical, so firstly, I think it's important to remark that in the literature, you are going to find more often the expression sense of agency more than subjective agency. But I prefer to use the expression subjective agency because it is more neutral, and it doesn't commit to the use of the notion of a sense, which is for me quite difficult to understand and maybe also to operationalize. And so I will use subjective agency for all these things, both the classical notion and the criticisms and the new proposal I will describe later. This classical notion of subjective agency, this classical account, concerns the first person perspective. It regards the first order phenomenology, and it concerns the subjective experience of the subject. It doesn't involve, and it requires, so it just involves a minimal awareness of initiating, controlling, executing some actions, and identifying, recognizing the effects of this action in the world. It doesn't necessarily include any cognitive awareness, so it doesn't include any explicit process of reflection on who and why the action has been executed, and it doesn't include any process of evaluation of the action execution itself. It is more embedded in an ongoing action and depends on sensorimotor processes, on the integration between action execution and the perception of the action and the consequences online. So how does it work? What are these sensorimotor processes? They are the intended states, or also called the motor goal of the actions, the motor command, which allows the effective execution of the action, and the outcome of the movement. And the comparison between the goal, the command, and the outcome underpins the subjective experience of actions. This account has been modeled through an extension of the forward model, which has been proposed by neurophysiologists like Blackmore, Volpert, and Frith, and then used by philosophers as well, like Gallagher, to explain, to model the emergence of subjective agency. And according to this account, the subjective experience of action works as follows. So let's take a fictional individual, what you're seeing on the right side of the slide. Let's call it Gina. So Gina is is executing an action, which is pressing on a key. She has then an intended state, which is the motor goal, reaching and pressing on the key, which then primes, so triggers the motor command, the motor plan, which allows the movement to be executed, producing then the actual state, the outcome of the action, which is the pressing with the finger on the key. And the motor command produces an inference copy, which is an internal representation of the motor operation, the motor information, which also contain a prediction of the possible sensory effect of the action itself. And so the comparison between the intended state and the forward model produced by the efference copy produces a sense of ownership, which is a fundamental part of the minimal embodied self belonging to the classical notion that I'm describing here. The sense of ownership is the subjective experience of having a body, but I'm not going to talk about this now. The comparison instead between the intended state, which is identified with the premotor preparatory processes and mechanism of the motor signals itself, with the predicted state produced by the efference copy and the actual state, which are the sensory reafferent feedback, produces the sense of agency. So the feeling, the experience, the subjective experience of executing the action, like reaching and pressing on a key. So what are the evidence for what is the evidence for this account? So there have been there has been a series of experiments to support this kind of this notion and this account, that assuming that subjective agency arises from the comparison between action, motor execution, prediction, and sensory effect, try to manipulate this relationship to investigate how subjective agency, the recognition of the self produced action, will be affected. I'm going to discuss one specific experiment, which has been conducted by Tsakiris and colleagues in 2005, where so this is a 2x2 factorial design, experimental design, where one of the factor is the self-generated action, where the subject has to press with the left index finger a key which lifts the movement of the right index finger. while the subject is either observing as sensory feedback the own end or the other hand. And the second factor is the externally generated action, where the experimenter is on the left side of the keyboard producing an action with the index finger, with the left index finger, producing, lifting the movement of the right index finger in the subject, while the subject is observing either the own end or the other end. And the result of this experiment showed that the participants were pretty accurate to, and so I forgot, after each of these trials that were randomized, they had, so the participants had to click on a yes or no. Yes, when they thought the lifted finger was their own, the self body, the self action, or when the finger was, when they thought that the finger was the experimenter's finger. And the results show that the participants were pretty accurate when they were observing their own hand, while the performance dropped significantly when they were observing the other hand. And this was interpreted as a proof of the fact that subjective agency arises from the comparison between motor output, sensory feedback, and mediated by the predictive state generated by the motor output, while neither the motor output or the sensory feedback by itself would produce this effect. And this kind of evidence has been replicated quite robustly. And in each of these experiments, they're assuming this notion of subjective agency, experimented manipulating the action effect, such that they violate the temporal and spatial contingency to the participant action. And so in various ways, the participants were asked to judge whether they produce the observer effect or not. And they tend to judge that the effects have been externally generated when this manipulation between the action and the effect are stronger. So following these adult experiments, this notion of subjective agency has been extended also to early development, and some experiments like those of Rochelle, Triano, Watanabe, and Taka have been interpreted as supporting this view of subjective agency. Here, for example, you see some images that are recalling to those experiments where they show that infants as old as 2 months are able to modulate their action execution in relation to the ongoing conditional feedback associated to the sucking behavior. So, and this was demonstrated both with general auditory feedback associated in a congruent or incongruent perspective to the sucking behavior with the pacifier, or by associating to this behavior the voice of the mother. And other evidence have been seen in the fact that babies from 2 months are able to perform reaching and grasping actions where they need to monitor the incongruent and congruent matching between their output prediction and the sensory feedback in order to accomplish the goal. And also other experiments, more sophisticated, using mobile devices, have been performed with the same assumptions and with the same experimental designs. So, however, let's see, I lost, I think you are not seeing any animation, but I will now talk of the criticisms of the that have been addressed to this notion, to the classical notion of subjective agency. And I think that one of so some of the most important criticism are that by defining subjective agency through this comparison, through this matching mechanism among the between these low-level factors, one consequence, one risk is that we are black boxing the development of subjective agency. We are flattening the subjective interpretation, the phenomenological interpretation, or the mental interpretation, if you want, to the behavioral data, to the behavioral evidence. And in this way, this framework is not able to account for the possible variations that there are, that could be associated with variations in the behavior of the babies across development and also in adults. And so, for example, what happens at the phenomenological level or at the mental level when the babies, when the infants start to produce and are become more skillful in producing goal-directed actions or more complex intentional action, how the subjective agency will change. And also, I think one important criticism is that according to this account, there is an improper analogy from the adult to the infant experiences, because what we are observing in the adult cases could be could involve additional cognitive mechanisms that are not in place in the case of infants. And also, I think that this account is making and is proposing an ambiguous conception of intended state, because if the intended state is simply a premotor mechanism proceeding in the order of milliseconds the execution of the action itself, then we don't have so many reasons to think that the subjective experience of the action that we are observing in the adult is also present in infants, how it is present, and whether we can extend the same explanation to non-verbalizing, non-speaking individuals. And I don't want to give the impression that I'm the only one who developed this criticism or this unsatisfaction with this classical account. There have been other examples which I quite fully embrace. Here you are seeing some papers which I like. For example, a paper Self-by-Doing from Verschuur and Hummel, two neurophysiologists, which criticize this quite inatistic conception of subjective agency, and or the paper A Match Doesn't Make a Sense, where a group of neuroscientists are making an important point. So the fact that the infants are able to categorize self-generated and externally generated action does not mean that this categorization is producing the phenomenon that they are describing. And also, frankly, the advocates of the classical account, like Sean Gallagher, Elizabeth Pachauri, also move toward the more multi-layer perspective or account of subjective agency, where they recognize that there could be multiple mechanisms in producing this experience. But what they don't really do, in my opinion, is to connect the changes in behavior, the changes in the involvement of the intentional state with a subjective state in a way that it is parsimonious, in a way that it is not flattened on the behavioral description, and so preventing the extension of this account to developmental and comparative investigations. And so by starting with this criticism, I will try to propose a novel conception, a novel concept of the, a novel conception of subjective agency, which tries to make a little bit of a clarity in the concept of intended state, in order to satisfy the criteria that I have explained. So this novel proposal would make use of an appropriate subjective marker, not simply a behavioral marker. It would be based on psychophysical studies, and these studies connect the use, so the measures of time perception and causality in intentional context. These psychophysical studies that I take in consideration for developing this revised notion are the binding experiments. So these experiments show that the perception of action and the temporal perception of action and their effect is subjective change under various conditions. And they have been already considered, honestly, as indirect measure of the classical account of subjective agency. But the new results of these experiments developed in the last 20 years and not being considered integrated. And so also because these results challenge the classical notion and allows us to move toward another more sophisticated view. So this is the pioneering study on intentional binding, published in Nature in 2002 by Haggard, Clark, and Kalogeras. So what the author do in this experiment is to use the Libet clock, a clock which rotates in 2,300, if I'm not wrong, millisecond, with one arm, and they ask the participant to produce a key press voluntarily, and to listen to a tone 250 milliseconds after producing this action, and to report both the time where they feel the urge to execute the action and when they listen to the tone. And they compare to this condition, to this principal condition, which they call voluntary condition, to another condition where the participants were simply administered with a sham TMS pulse in an area of the motor cortex of the brain where it doesn't produce any behavioral motor effect. And with another condition where instead the TMS is producing a pulse on the area of the motor cortex that produces the same action in like in the voluntary condition, but in this case the condition it is involuntary, is categorized as involuntary. And they also have a baseline condition where the participant has to only press the key voluntarily or listen to the tone in a separated way. And in all these conditions, they have to report the timing of the action and the effect. And what they find is that only in the voluntary action, the perceived time between the action execution and the effect is compressed compared to the time of the perception of the first stimulus and of the second stimulus in the other conditions. And this and many other studies that have been conducted later on have been interpreted as confirming, as providing an indirect subjective measure of the conception of the sense of agency, because the subject here only during the voluntary action are having a motor goal, like they are preparing the action that would in this way delay the perception of the beginning of the action and also the perception of the effect. The thing is that later on these experiments have been replicated also with the non-intentional actions, and there's been an accumulation of these experiments, so that the expression that is used to refer to the binding experiment is not anymore intentional binding, but is temporal binding. And one of these experiments I would like to discuss here is has been conducted by Brunner in 2012, where the conditions were a baseline condition and compared with the self-generated action and the externally, so a machine causal condition. Where, so what the participants had to do is to anticipate the occurrence of a flashlight, a LED flash, which could be in the, you can see the B level, which could be either produced by a machine, where the participants had to initiate the machine, that after a random interval, always changing between the 2000 and 5000 milliseconds, would make the machine being activated, and then after a fixed interval but varying interval, would produce the light, the LED light to flash, and participants had to anticipate this. This is an event in anticipation task. In the self-causal condition, the participants were producing the action by themselves, which after a fixed varying interval again would produce the flashlight that had to be anticipated. And in the baseline condition number, so D, the first stimulus was simply a light, and then after the same intervals, the flash would appear, and participants again had to anticipate it. And what they find is that only during the self-causal and the machine causal conditions, the interval between the two stimuli was shorter, while during the baseline condition, this was not significant. And again, this kind of experiment have been replicated many times. One of the last one is coming from Suzuki in 2019, where they use a virtual reality design to compare active, no hand, and fake conditions that were always using the same kind of stimuli, and where the observer, where the participants were aware of the causal relationship between the two, so producing comparable results at the time perception level. And in many of these experiments that test the causal attribution, how the causal attribution of the subject produce this compression in time, there always be a kind of intentional boost, so more compression when the action is self-caused. But the fact that this happens only when there is, so the subject is attributing a causal relationship between the two events, made experimenters, researchers to think that in the intentional, the motor prediction itself is not sufficient and probably also not necessary to produce this effect. So what the temporal binding experiments show is that this effect does not occur with mere action-effect correlations, because when the stimuli are, when the two same stimuli are not connected causally, this effect is not present. It occurs with both self and externally attributed causal relations. And so in an action, in an intentional context, the intention seems to be, so to need to be causally informed. This would suggest a possible way on how the comparator model could be integrated, so modified in order to account for the emergence of the subjective experience of agency. So in this case, the intended state is not simply preceding the motor command, but is also responsible, or it is connected to an action selection, which is selected for its causal power in virtue of its causal relation with the sensory affect. And so this led me to propose a revised account of subjective agency. And according to this account, action awareness, so the subjective experience of action, emerges, when subjects acquire a causal link between the action and the effect. Because acquiring this, so a causal relation between action events seems to restructure previously acquired information at a low level processing about these actions, these action events, giving rise to subjective changes and measurable changes in event timing. And so the causal attribution seems to affect the time perception of these events by deforming the gravity of the temporal space, moving actions more closer to their consequences, and consequences closer to their effect. And this is what I think a proposal which is much more explanatory and parsimonious, because it is using changes in time perception that can be measured at the behavioral level as a subjective marker, without flattening the mental and the subjective description to the behavioral data. And this novel proposal is evidently still based on the integration and the comparison between action and effect, but it is enriched by the causal attribution among the two. So let's proceed to the implications and perspective of this view. And this is the part where the collaboration with Colin is more substantial, even though I have to say he provided invaluable comments, feedback, and useful discussion online and also on the papers that I submitted to philosophical psychology. But within now we are analyzing the implications of these experiments of temporal binding and what it could, so how this causal attribution could be analyzed and interpreted in a broader conception of cognition and the mental representation. So what we are, so the starting point would be that, first of all, so the goal-directed actions that have been used to explain the classical account do not require any causal attribution, and so they are simply finalized movements which are sensitive to outcome contingencies. But the kind of actions and the kind of causal attributions that the temporal binding are showing and inquiring into could be more interpreted as fully intentional action or means and planning behavior, where that include the distinct and the composable representations of the means and the end, where the means, the action is selected on the basis of the causal relation, on the basis of the causal powers that have to produce the desired effect. And we are basing this starting point on also on Colin's work, but also on quite similar proposals that have been done in the literature by other philosophers. So the question is, can we interpret these the attribution of the causal relations that the subject do during this experiment as causal inference? And if inferences are assumptions formed through learning and can be and are defined as processes that are drawing conclusions about the causal relations based on conditions of occurrence of an effect, I think that this attribution would be justified. It is true that in the binded experiment that I've discussed here, it is more evident how the priorly formed causal attribution between two events, a stimulus, an action and the effect, affect the time perceived among the two. But there are also evidence that suggests that the low-level features that are normally considered to trigger or to lead the subject to form a causal inference modulate the magnitude of the temporal binding of the causal perception and the compression of this time. And if this is true, if this causal attribution of whether the attribution of a causal relation from the subject can be considered a causal inference, it seems that this inference can be formed without words. It doesn't require symbolic representation or specific linguistic propositional capacities. And so what we are trying to do is to find a place to locate these mental representation that include a causal relation, that represent a causal relation in a way that also can be marked and include a subjective aspect and can be identified through changes in behavior. And it seems to us that this representation can be located in between a first order sensorimotor level, including the Sensorimotor Associations, so simply perceptually based representations and operation made with them, and the symbolic representation. So this abstracted supramodal intermediate level would be supramodal because is independent from the specific sensory modality with which the action and the effect are executed. And also it would be it is independent, as the experiments on temporal binding show, from the specific causal mechanism that is present between the action and the effect. So the subjects, the participants, do not need to understand and to know the specific causal mechanism that is connecting the two in order to attribute or to infer a causal relationship there. And this representation would also be explicit by exclusion, I would say, in the sense that if this is different from mere action-effect associations, where the causal properties of the object are simply implicitly represented, and so this this can be understood as an explicit mental process that can be defined as a non-encapsulated, like a more flexible process that can be flexibly combined with different effects and in different, and used in different situations. So this body of work and interpretation will pave the way to a series of implications and perspective, because elaborating on the intermediate level, or this intermediate level of mental representation, would allow us to contribute to current debates in animal cognition, where there are where the opposition between the associationist and the cognitivist are still pretty strong, especially in relation to causal cognition, where associationists think and claim that first order perceptually based representation are both necessary and sufficient for explaining animal behavior in causal conditions, while cognitivists tend to think that and claim that in order to explain the behavior, more flexible, more creative behavior of some animal species with tool use and with specific causal challenges, we need something more or something different than the perceptually based low-level representation. And also, by starting on this, from this basis and interpretation, we are trying to offer some suggestion and hints for experimental design that can use they can make use of measures in time perception to identify these intermediate level. There are some open questions like that I will not be able to really answer to, but this just to see to show what we are thinking and how what we also consider that have to be developed in the future. One important thing would be to clarify the relationship between the first level, the first sensorimotor association order, and the second one defined as this intermediate abstracted level of explicit representation. And of course, this is an experimental question, but also I also think that we can at least set the stage to give some suggestion of how these kind of problems could be stated or formulated. And of course, another important point would be what is the function of this second of the intermediate level. And yes, this is pretty much my presentation. Thanks for your attention. Sorry again for the problems, and I look forward to your questions and feedback on all of this.
All right, thank you very much, Antonella. One of the issues with Zoom webinar that we cannot clap, but I'm sure everyone is clapping on their own. Let me remind you that we are going to, I'm going to move you from the status of attendees to the status of panelists. Please write your name in the Q&A box, and I will promote you so that you can ask your question directly to Antonella. John, I'm going to promote you directly. All right. John, you can turn your camera on and unmute yourself and ask your question to Antonella directly.
Excellent. Great. Okay, good. Thanks. Thanks, Antonella. Really interesting talk. I wonder if you can say a little bit more of the point you mentioned at the end, and that's the hints that you're trying to come up with regard to experimental design. Can you tell us in a little more detail about what some of those hints might be that you've come up with so far?
Sure. So there are a couple of suggestions that we are trying to do. There have been a small number of temporal binding investigations in infants from 4 years using not the Libet clock, but either event anticipation task or motor synchrony task, where the participant has to judge with a click or with the key press whether the two stimuli are occurring simultaneously or not. And by using this motor synchrony or event anticipation, you can test in species, I guess, at least this is what I think, and the discussion with some developmental psychologists are producing, that with species like primates and maybe also avians like crows, it is possible to time the perception of the first and the second stimulus, both in a self-action, self-generated action perspective or in an observed perspective, because there are also temporal binding studies that show that this effect of temporal compression between the two stimuli occur during in an observer perspective when the causal relationship is attributed.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, John. Any further question? So while people are manifesting themselves, I had some question for you, but I suspect there's a question that are, in a sense, asking you for further development. and maybe that's kind of thing you're going to be working on in the future. So in some ways, I find it a bit surprising, the general effect connecting causation, or at least a representation of one's causal contribution, and a shortening of the time perception between action and effect. I mean, it's an apparently robust effect, but it is a surprising effect in some ways, right? And it's surprising because why would it be the case? Why would it be the case that acting leads to somehow feeling that the effect is closer to the action? And so, in a sense, what I would like to hear from you is, if not an answer to the question, at least some speculations, at least some functional speculation. Is that just a byproduct, an accident, or is it actually a reason why there are this coalescing of these two blocks, so to speak, together?
Yeah, thanks. This is an important question. I will start from the mechanicistic level more than the functional level, because there have been investigations of what is happening in the brain when this effect occurs. I don't want to say that these experiments are conclusive, but they give a direction. They offer a direction to think about this difference. And there have been also behavioral studies that point in the same direction. So it seems that when I'm simply performing a goal-directed actions, I don't need to activate the predicted sensorial effect before the execution of the action itself. So the activation of the motor command, it's enough. It's more immediate. While and then it triggers the sensory effect. While during let's say truly intentional actions, the representation of the possible effect of the action is activated before the selection of the action itself. This is also mirrored in a enhanced prepotentiation of some parietal areas and other areas of the brain. Of course, I don't want to say that there is a precise localization, but when an action is performed, there is so the brain is activating in relation to the motor effector and to the type of stimuli that the individual is processing, and this is creating different kind of mechanism in the brain. This more enhanced prepotentiation is creating, like, let me see metaphorically, like a wave that is stronger in the brain, which is connected bidirectionally, the action and the effect, so producing this temporal illusion. And at the functional level, we do not know exactly why this happened. There are two hypotheses that experimenters are exploring. One is connected to this enhanced neural prepotentiation. And the other one, which is not mutually exclusive, regards the internal clock. So the fact that by having this different mechanism, the rhythmic pulse of the brain change, and the subject acquired this different temporal result. I don't want to say impression, but this different temporal perception. And it could be that the temporal binding is is functional for the subject to acquire to learn in an associative learning perspective the results of his own action more when it is causally produced. I don't know exactly how so we cannot say how exactly the explicit level is interacting with the low level processing and how they are interacting when there is a conflict, for example, between the two. But and it could be that the effect, the intermediate level, is simply showing an epiphenomenal representation that it doesn't really have a real functional advantage, but it's there, and it could be used for understanding how to differentiate between two different mental representations that are present in the subject.
Thank you very much. Again, let me ask you to write your name in the Q&A box to ask a question to Antonella. Since right now there's just no one else, let me just follow up this on a slightly different question. You know, I mean, it seems to follow directly from your views, but I wanted to, well, actually, it's first a clarification question. So what exactly, I suppose it's not simply being a causal agent, right? You must have a representation of your own causal contribution, right? So what matters is not simply causing, it's representing oneself as causing, right? Or is that correct?
Can you please say again? I think I didn't really.
So I wanted to make sure that I understand that the claim is not simply that causing a behavioral outcome leads us to this temporal binding. It's rather representing oneself as causing a behavioral outcome leads to the temporal binding.
So I don't know why you're saying representing the self. So I will simply say, I don't think that, so I still think that this conception of subjective agency is implicit. Sure, in the sense that what is explicit there is the relation between the first stimulus and the second one. It's not that the subject is really thinking about himself or herself and the action that he's producing. The action execution, which is connected explicitly to the sensory outcome. And in that sense, the content of the representation is simply the action itself with its what is targeted, what is referring to as a possible consequence. So this is why I was saying before, we don't need to think that this kind of representation has a causal power. It could be simply epiphenomenal in relation. So it doesn't have to be conscious and causally effective to produce the execution of the action. It could occur later on in the process of action execution.
Yeah. Okay. So that's helpful. Let me just tell you why I was asking that clarification question. So I was wondering what your predictions were for if there are any people with various cognitive disorders, for example. I don't know whether these people exist, but people who have a hard time representing themselves as causing outcome, or even people whose causal cognition is impaired. I don't know whether those people exist, or moving away from neuropsychology, looking at maybe species for which it's actually unclear whether they have any causal sense or represent themselves or represent causal relations in contrast to merely correlational relations. So I'm wondering exactly what the predictions of your models are. You know, how, where, and when and when not should we find a temporal binding? So do you have any specific predictions about the circumstances in which we should not find temporal binding?
Yeah, so I think that in some cases, in schizophrenia, for example, it is possible that we don't find significant temporal binding because these kind of prediction effects are impaired or dysfunctional, and it is possible that the prediction of the action and this attribution of a causal relation is not able to anticipate the occurrence of the stimulus of the effect, and so is not producing the temporal compression between the two. From a developmental perspective, if we look at the evidence that we already have, I think that before the first year of life, we could not find it as well, because infants are starting to be sensible to causal impression from 6 months, more or less, and they are able to produce goal-directed actions that are sensitive to the sensory feedback, but they do not associate the action and the effect in this bidirectional way, in a way that they fully show means and planning and reasoning. And so I would also predict that we cannot find any temporal binding there. In a comparative perspective, I think that candidate species could be species that show more flexible behavior in tool use and in means and planning. And it is possible that other species do not have significantly this effect. So I think it could be useful to revise and interpret subjective agency in this way, in a way that it can mirror both the subjective experience, but also the capacity to form causal inference.
Cool. Yes, that's really helpful. John had another question. So
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. I've been thinking about what you said earlier about experimental hints for experimentalists, and this can be totally off base, but because I'm still trying to get a feel for what this temporal binding is all about. But wouldn't standard operant conditioning in just any kind of animal model meet what you're talking about here with the temporal binding? I mean, where the animal learns that by engaging in a particular action, it's either going to have a reward delivered or a aversive stimulus removed. Isn't that going to be an account? Isn't that going to meet the conditions on temporal binding?
So you mean that in a standard instrumental learning paradigm,
just standard operant conditioning.
So a temporal binding is inquired through instrumental learning.
Okay.
So it is exactly the paradigm that is used to see whether the execution of action and the effect are related in specific ways. And of course, in the animal case, in an animal context, this always has to include a reward. And I think that could be, I'm not an experimentalist, so I don't know precisely, but it could create some confounding factor. But if you use the reward mechanism across all the conditions, I think this condition could be normalized.
I see. Okay, great.
Can I add something there? Hopefully you can hear me. So John, you asked a question about operant conditioning, and Antonella, you responded about instrumental conditioning. And
right.
I just want to pull those two apart slightly, because we know that instrumental conditioning can happen in the spinal cord without the kind of full generality of operant conditioning that requires an intact mammal or bird or organism at least level, something in this brain of those kinds of organisms. And so I think that, this partly goes back perhaps to answering Eduard's question too, is that you might find organisms that are capable of the more minimal form of instrumental conditioning, where you would get no evidence then of a timing adjustment that within the system. They're just chained to the actual timing of events rather than this subjective relationship that's established when operant conditioning or perhaps other forms of causal categorization are going on, right?
Thanks, Colin. All right. We have time for one or two more questions if someone wants to raise one. 1, 2, 3. So I think we are done for today. Thanks, Antonella, for this really wonderful talk. And sorry again for the issues at the beginning of this lecture. We're sorry we could not host you as a center, but there will be further occasions down the line once we're all vaccinated and free again. It's been really a wonderful lecture and really good to see you again.
Thanks a lot for this event. Thanks for.
Thank you, and we hope to see you, most of you or all of you on Thursday for the cognitology seminar, and on Friday for Simon Dedeo's lecture on mathematical truths and their proofs. See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye.